you were saying that being called anti-Semitic is a way to silence people, and then you were silenced.
There I was.
And, or each of us who has spoken, we were all silenced there for a little while. And I think, Emma, if you are listed as Marie, would you change your name? And let's—
No, I'm back to WAM questions.
Oh, you're okay. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep, and I've restarted the live streams on Facebook and YouTube.
I see that you have.
Sorry about that, everybody.
I see that you have, and
I just wanted to leave it on one point of Israel influencing U.S. foreign policy, if possible. If not, I can talk about it later.
someone is saying that someone in a chat just said that the meeting was 40 minutes and Zoom kicks off after 40 minutes for free Zoom, but our account isn't free and it's been going for more than an hour. So that isn't it. It was something else that shut it down. So Manar, you finish one more time.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, before it cut off, I was talking about how the label anti-Semitism is just an ad hominem attack to silence and censor dissent. In terms of Israel being the largest purveyor of anti-Semitism and actually Islamophobia in the world, Israel has been caught and actually called out by over 40 human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, for arming literal Nazis like the Azov battalion in Ukraine, which basically was like a US-backed and Israeli-backed coup that overthrew the democratically elected government there to bring in Western corporations to take over the economy there. And so, but then we also have Israel influencing US politics in terms of increasing funding and arming to right-wing groups like ISIS, groups like right-wing activists and extremists in Sudan, in countries like Sudan and Libya and Syria, where people, and actually Al-Qaeda even, who have an extremist Wahhabi Salafist ideology, a politicized ideology, who promote the idea of destroying Israel, which is then used to support more aggressive US foreign policy and arming of more rebels and arming of right-wing governments in the Middle East, when in fact these groups actually target Muslims in the region. And so that's kind of how the cycle is. It's a very disturbing cycle, but that's how Israel gets away with a lot, because then we get distracted with these civil wars and sectarian wars and conflicts and these failed states, like what's happening in Sudan, with the splitting up the country, and in Libya with it being a failed state and being taken over by ISIS. And all the attention steers away from the atrocities that Israel is committing against Palestinians.
Thank you, Manar. I want to say one thing, and that is that because this Zoom meeting has been shut down once, it may be shut down again or again and again. So if we lose touch, because apparently the everything was shut down, the Facebook connection and everything. So if you are if you lose this connection, just go back and start it up again, please. Your reference to the campaigns. Let's talk a little bit about some of the forces behind the candidates in the primary battle in Minnesota's 5th district. Senna talked about Betty McCollum's district not being, or Betty herself not being as attacked as Ilhan Omar has been the representative in the 5th district. Would someone want to say something about the 5th district issues? Wave to me. I can't see the guys.
Oh.
Wait a minute now. Where are they? I'm going back. Raphael or
Looks like Manar had something.
Manar has something. And I think, no.
I can
Go
talk
ahead,
a little bit
Manar.
about I can talk a little bit about 5th district issues, but not so much about who's behind the candidates.
Okay,
I was actually on the streets with Emma. We were live streaming and covering the George Floyd protests, a couple months ago, and it was very incredible to be on the ground in Minneapolis, in South Minneapolis, to see what the people were angry about. And it was, obviously George Floyd's death was, the trigger that just blew, it just erupted this entire movement for social justice and protest movement across the country. I mean, it was the epicenter right here in Minneapolis, the epicenter of the revolution, to bring attention to the plight of, Black Lives Matter, police brutality, and income inequality and economic injustice. And what I saw there was very incredible, because it's an area where Ilhan Omar represents, and the people there brought up so many issues beyond police brutality and racial injustice. The people there described issues that I was extremely impressed and proud of them for bringing up. They weren't just talking about police brutality and racial injustice. They were also talking about money and getting money out of politics, dismantling the entire two-party system and ending, Israeli training of our US police forces. And so I was very proud of the people there for bringing these issues to light and protesting them and chanting their slogans at these mass movements. And something that was very, one of the main issues that people talked about, there were two. One of them was elections and how the two-party system does not represent we the people. The second issue was income inequality. We live in a country where less than 1,000 billionaires, the 1%, own the wealth, the mass wealth of this country. And people like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Michael Bloomberg, these billionaires, they are the ones who are basically, accruing all of this wealth, especially amid this coronavirus pandemic. They accrued more wealth in the coronavirus pandemic when over 40 million Americans applied for unemployment. And so all of these issues, though, are related, because we have a police force that are suppressing the people here in the 5th district, in Minneapolis, in southern Minneapolis, or South Minneapolis, and a police force that is racially profiling. They're surveilling the streets. They are suppressing people's right to activism. And I know that WHAM has done a lot of really incredible work in social justice organizing here. And then we have a mainstream media, whether it's on the local level or the mainstream level, a media that, silences dissent and uses things like, anti-Semitism to silence any sort of dissent. And then we have this electoral system, which is so corrupted with so much money from these, special interest groups and these lobby groups that pour in millions upon millions of dollars into these elected officials that don't come to represent we the people. And so we have an entire system, basically, not just, the one or two issues. It's an entire system that has to be broken down and rebuilt from the bottom up, and it can only happen through local organizing and activism. And so these are the really, really important issues that I'm hearing more and more people talk about, especially in the 5th district. And I'm very proud of them to be talking about these issues, because I would say about 10 years ago, people were still having at least a little bit of hope, at least even in the two-party system. They at least believed that maybe somebody like Bernie Sanders could save us, right? But now we have, on the presidential front, we're basically left to choose between Joe Biden, who can barely form a coherent sentence, and Trump, who's like a sexual predator, and also we have another sexual predator here by Joe Biden. And so people are starting to really, really wake up. They're so frustrated by the system that they are, they're starting to wake up that this whole system needs to be dismantled and broken down and rebuilt from the bottom up.
Thank you, Manar. Raphael, are you waving to me? Would you like to chime in here? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that, Manar. There was so much in there. I really appreciate all the things that you had to say. And I was actually, it made me think, because I was at one of the protests at the 3rd district, and they were actually shooting at the crowd, and they were using the rubber, they were like rubber canisters.
Yeah, rubber canisters.
And it was just very, it reminded me, because when I was in Palestine and I was at the Waldorf Hotel, they have a museum there that has on display all the different military, weapons, and they had that same rubber canister that they were shooting at us in Minneapolis. The same things were being used in Palestine. So it's very directly correlated. They're using the same weapons. They're getting trained by the Israeli military. Our U.S. police is getting trained by them, and that's actually one of the things that JVP is trying to campaign against, the deadly exchange. And so that's like a significant issue. And also I wanted to speak on how Ilhan Omar doesn't take money from corporations, and her average donation is about $18, whereas Melton Mew has donations with an average amount of like $650. And he's taking significant donations from corporations and from pro-Israeli lobbies. He's also worked at a law firm, Jackson Lewis, which was an anti-union law firm. And whereas Omar is endorsed by unions like AFL-CIO and the Education Minnesota. And so we just see like someone who's like Omar, in my opinion, is much more for the people. And then we have someone like Melton Mew, who's taking big bucks from pro-Israeli lobbies and corporations. And he really doesn't he takes a very moderate stance on, way too moderate of a stance on the conflict between Palestine and Israel. And I just, personally, it's just, I see there's a lot of problems with that, and it's gonna make, there's not gonna be any change, and we need change now. And I'm just not seeing that. And I'm not seeing that in any of the candidates as well. I'm not seeing that from Biden. I'm not certainly not seeing that from Trump. And yeah, and also what you had to say about anti-Semitism is very poignant, because Semitic, the word actually refers to the Semitic languages of Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, and other languages. So it's not limited to just the Hebrew language or Jews or Judaism. So it's like, it doesn't make sense in the first place. And the only way that I understand it is that I had a Jewish friend explain it to me, because he took a course on the Holocaust. And he said that during the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime, that they used the word Semitism as a way to racialize the Jews as a racial group. And they used that as a way to oppress them. And that's the only reason why anti-Semitism is even a word, is because they did that. But the Nazis totally took that and up on its head, like they did with so many other things. And so it's not representative of Semitism at all. And the word has totally been lost, I think, and needs to be reclaimed, in my opinion, to its original meaning. So that's what I think.
Thank you. You've touched on two things. One is you talked about a little bit about Melton Mews, who is running in the primary against Ilhan Omar in the 5th Congressional District in Minnesota, which includes Minneapolis and some surrounding suburbs or nearby suburbs. And you also mentioned Jewish Voice for Peace and the Deadly Exchange Project, and we want to get back to both of those. Is there something else we want to say? Does anyone else want to add something about the use of the term or anti-Semitism as a silencing device, or Manar? Yeah.
All right, one quick point, I promise.
Okay.
It's related to her to Antoine Melton, and anti-Semitism, because I was reading an article yesterday how his campaign actually just accused her of anti-Semitism because her campaign pointed out that he was being funded by Wall Street and by big corporations. And then it named in her letter, in one of her ads that went out in the letter campaign, it actually named like 3 major donors he had. They just happened to be Jewish. And you know, her ad did not mention that they were Jewish. She just said that, you know, his donors are big money donors that work in Wall Street. And so his response again was just to attack her with anti-Semitism. That's it. And so it just doesn't, it's never going to stop. It's going to continue. And it's going to continue to, you know, the GOP, people in the GOP are going to use it. And people even in this article, by the way, that was pointing this out was from Vice News, which I'd like to point out is a neoliberal media organization that, you know, on the outside likes to present itself as, you know, hip, progressive, but on the inside, it's funded by billionaires. It's funded by the billionaire class. And one of its top donors actually is like a Fox News mogulate. So a lot of these organizations that are promoting even on the left are these neoliberal organizations, and we have to really even be careful of that too. I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Thank you. And Santa, you had something you wanted to add? And
Yeah.
Wave at me, anybody else, if you have something to add, please.
Just wanted to add in terms of Melton Mew, he also has a slew of Republican Party donors. That's something that we need to pay attention to. And I would, because he seems to, I don't know, is he a minister or some kind of relationship he has to the church? I would not be surprised that he's also receiving money from Christian Zionists. And so that too is something we need to pay attention to. And Manar, when you mentioned the Wall Street Journal piece and she was attacked, Ilhan has been attacked because of being anti-Semitic. One of the names in that list was somebody named Gray. And so there was no way that she knew whether or not he was Jewish or not. But yeah, that's a constant. That's a constant in terms of calling various people anti-Semitic. Another person that came to my mind was even with Keith Ellison, who during his time as congressman, he was indeed very supportive of a lot of Israeli relationships between the US and Israel, even though he did indeed, he visited Gaza, I believe 3 times. And so he certainly did have also an interest in the rights of Palestinians. But I think when we saw him really being considered anti-Semitic was when he attempted to become the chair of the Democratic National Committee. And so there were smears that were going around saying that he was an anti-Semite. And so once again, just another way of attacking somebody, and as Manar mentioned, to silence people. And so we've certainly seen that happen.
Okay, Tarek, unmute. Okay, thank you.
I wanted to just spend just a little bit of time just to break down how the logic of the spreading of this label anti-Semitism works. Essentially, the way that it's broken down is essentially like this. It is anti-Jewish bigotry. And if you say anything that is anti-Israel or you label Israel as an apartheid state, you are labeling the state of the Jewish people as such, therefore you're labeling the Jewish people as such, therefore you are against the Jewish people, and therefore you're anti-Semitic. So that's really the logical extension of that label. So because that is how Israel defines itself, and if you say anything that is against Zionist policy, now there's this equation, this interchangeability between Zionism and Judaism and Jewishness. So that's why that is sort of picking up steam. Now you actually have debates. I watched the debate recently that the title of it is anti-Semitism the same as anti-Zionism? The fact that you can even have a debate like that is just mind-boggling, because of course it's not. But that's what's picking up steam, is that you can't hide behind your quote unquote anti-Semitism by labeling it anti-Zionism. So this is kind of a way to counter what Ilhan Omar did, for instance. So that's really what we have to grapple with and what we have to combat. We have to respond to this intellectually by really defining Zionism and putting it in its proper place and removing the anti-Semitism label from it by also defining that as well, and creating this wedge, this separation between these two terms, because these two terms have nothing in common whatsoever.
Thank you. Thank you. What I'm thinking about now, the general public, the citizens, the people of the United States of America. And sometimes, or over the last years or a decade or two, some people have said, oh, I think that some attitudes are changing toward Israel as a recipient of US, what, $3.8 billion a year this year? Or are we hearing more about the plight or the oppressions of Palestinian people? Do you think there have been changes? Would anyone like to speak to that issue? Or do you have a sense that things are getting better? Anybody? Wave to me if you think. Okay, Tarek, go ahead. Yeah. Are you muted? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Are things where I would like them to be? No, but are things moving in the right direction? Absolutely. Now you can actually invoke labels that were considered anathema just a few years ago. So AOC's letter highlighting the word apartheid, I think multiple times in her letter. Now a congresswoman can actually say that word. I mean, a few years ago, you say it, you're automatically labeled with the anti-Semitic label, and because of the education that we are instilling in the American public, and because of the change in technology, now you don't have to turn on the TV at 7 p.m. and watch whatever cable allows you to watch. Now you can go on your internet, go on your laptop, go on your iPhone, your iPad, whatever it is, and you can Google this stuff. You can find the information that you need, and you can confirm information as well. You can fact check this stuff. So people are doing their own homework. And the plight of the Palestinian people, if something occurs in Gaza, for instance, you don't know about it 2 weeks later. You know about it 10 seconds later. So it's the knowledge of what is happening is instantaneously learned by the world, and especially by the American public. So that's why this asymmetrical nature of this conflict has really become noticeable to the mainstream public, because for a long time, the roles have been reversed, right? It's not a war of independence. It's Nakba or catastrophe, it's the War of Independence. No, it's not illegal Israeli settlements, they're Jewish neighborhoods. No, it's not apartheid, it's a democracy. So now the American public is seeing that no, it is apartheid. No, it is illegal Israeli settlements. No, it's not a security barrier, it's an apartheid wall. No, that wall is not built on the so-called border or the green line. It's built deep into the West Bank itself, which is occupied Palestinian territory. No, the occupation in Gaza did not end. You're actually still occupying it by means of effective control and aerial bombardment and denial of resources and aid. No, the Palestinians that are living inside Israel proper are not real citizens of the state, because you make a distinction between citizenship and nationality, and they're not nationals of the state. Nationals of the state are Jews and not Palestinians. So actually there's an apartheid structure even within your own so-called democratic borders. So, these things are becoming much more known. They're not just known by us anymore. The American public are seeing through this and seeing through this canard, this label of democracy, and they're seeing apartheid for what it truly is. And Israel is the modern representation of that term. So you're absolutely seeing this sea change. And the fact that you can listen to a presidential debate and listen to one of the candidates spend some time talking about treating Palestinians as human beings and, accommodating their human rights, and we have to be fair to them. We have to be, in a presidential debate setting, that was never a topic. It was always centered around, structured around Israeli security, not human rights, not the rights of a people, but on the security of the state itself. So, we are definitely seeing this change. You can actually say the 3 forbidden letters, BDS, in a debate. You can actually you can actually reference that. Yes, we are definitely seeing a change, and it is growing, and we need to pick up the pace, because it is changing from within.
Would you tell us, for anyone who's not clear on it, BDS campaign is an international campaign, and it stands for?
BDS stands for Boycotts, Divestment, Sanctions. It is a civil society movement that started in 2005. We're 15 years in. Actually, we just celebrated the 15th anniversary, July of this year. It was after it essentially began a year after the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, advisory opinion on the apartheid wall, and declaring that wall illegal under international law, and that the West Bank and Gaza are occupied Palestinian territory, and that Israel is violating international law. And a year later, the BDS movement really began, and it's a Palestinian-run, Palestinian-started civil society worldwide organization that has now gained victory after victory after victory, mainly in the BD element. But once we get to the S element, sanctions, we'll begin to see the kind of change that we really need.
Thank you so much. And Raphael, did you have something you wanted to add? I think you did.
I did, but I think Manar was before me, so I think she should go first, and then
Okay, thank you, Manar. Whoops, wait. Oh, Manar, here we go. I think I'm having trouble unmuting you.
Am I muted? Okay.
You're okay. You're good. Thank you.
So I want to piggyback off of what everything Tarek said, because it's absolutely true and accurate. And that is why Israel is working so hard to control the narrative about Israel and Palestine. And so Israel has actually partnered up with tech giants in the United States, and the Israeli Mossad and several of their intelligence agencies have actually infiltrated US tech companies like Google, Microsoft, and Facebook to work to censor any kind of information about Israel and Palestine. And Facebook very specifically has also partnered up with a lot of news flaggers like BuzzFeed and the Atlantic Council, for example, which is a pro-Israel think tank. It's a neoconservative think tank that basically drafts like war policies, and it's for politicians, and it's also funded by Israel and major weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin. And what the Atlantic Council does and what BuzzFeed does and other neoliberal and neoconservative media organizations that have partnered up with Facebook is that they've actually become the flaggers of fake news online. And we have to really be careful about this new campaign that we're seeing from people on the left, even people like AOC who are sitting in the halls of Congress, and we see these viral videos going. Even today, we have these tech giants being questioned by Congress about why they're not taking more control of fake news online and conspiracy theories and right-wing news and pro-Trump ads and blah, 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 all these things, because that is a step into censorship. First, it starts with censoring things that we say are okay to censor, but in reality, that's actually their strategy in censoring other very important news pieces, because first they're going to say, we want to censor this, we want to block this because it's fake news, it's a conspiracy theory. And obviously right now with coronavirus, it's like the perfect time to censor all these like COVID conspiracies, right? And so that's all a farce to censor any sort of criticism of Israel, of war, of human rights abuses, of any US foreign policy. We've seen it. We've actually been a victim at MintPress. We've actually been targeted. Our cartoons have been flagged as anti-Semitic, cartoons by world-renowned cartoonist who works for MintPress, Carlos Latouf. He's illustrated these amazing cartoons of Israeli soldiers sniping peaceful demonstrators in Gaza at the Great Return March. And Facebook, Twitter, and I know it was Facebook and Instagram flagged those cartoons as anti-Semitic. They also flagged several of our news reports about Yemen, showing starving children, saying that this violates our community standards. And so all of these little rules that they're adding is really just a way in to begin censoring news. And believe it or not, Israel and Israeli intelligence and US intelligence and these pro-war think tanks are all working hand in hand with these social media tech giants who basically are the oligarch, they're owned by the oligarchs of this country, like Jeff Bezos and others, and Mark Zuckerberg, to control the narrative about anything related to war. And so we really have to be careful about that. I mean, I see my own friends who, who are progressive, and they're sharing these videos, clapping and commending AOC for really grilling Mark Zuckerberg about why isn't Facebook cracking down on these conspiracy theories on Facebook and these fake news things. But really, in reality, if you look deep into who's behind these campaigns, it's really just a step into censoring dissenting voices.
Thank you. Thank you. Sana and Raphael, did you have something you wanted to add before we go to Sana?
I did. Just real quickly, I just wanted to say that if you look at the history of the founding of the State of Israel, it was started, one of the founders of Zionism and that was Theodore Herzl, and he wrote a letter to Cecil Rhodes, who was the founder of apartheid in South Africa, and he called Zionism a colonial pursuit. So he called it a colonial pursuit in this letter to Cecil Rhodes. So to argue that it is anything but apartheid and colonialism is to argue against one of the very founders of it. So I just wanted to point that out, as well as the fact that the US is also a settler colonial empire as well. And has done apartheid in the past with indigenous people, with Black people, with people of color all over this country. And so, of course, the United States is not going to criticize another colonial empire because we ourselves have contributed to that. And there are a myriad of ways that we can look at that. There's actually a book published recently called, it's by an author, and he wrote about, what is the name of it? I'm forgetting the name of it. It's the history of the United States, the Hidden Empire, something along by Imivar. He's a Northwestern professor, and he writes about the history of the greater United States and how it's also a settler colonial empire. So of course we would not be condemning a country that is doing the very things that we have done in our history and have not yet even acknowledged ourselves as a US empire. So I just wanted to make that statement.
Thank you. We have a couple questions from our audience and a couple of comments.
Can I just, something quick?
Yeah. Oh, Sana, yes, go ahead.
You had asked earlier whether or not we're seeing any attitude changes. And just today, I remember coming across this article about Joaquin Castro, who is the twin brother of the Castro, I can't think of his first name right now, who ran for president. Joaquin is a congressman, and I believe from Texas, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, he is interested in, he's vying for the chair, the seat of the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that was chaired by Eliot Ingalls, and all of us know that he was a very strong Israel supporter. And Ilhan Omar is also on that particular committee. But I want to bring this to your attention when we're talking about attitudes changing. One of the things that Castro is saying, Joaquin Castro is saying, is that America needs to have a different type of foreign policy in the Middle East. And he specifically speaks about the lack of Palestinian voices being heard. And this is what he says. He says, I think too often Palestinian voices have been excluded. If the US is going to be an arbiter of peace, it has to be willing to hear from the different sides. And in my estimation, we've not always done that. I don't think we would have heard another congressperson, especially vying for chair of that particular, the Foreign Affairs Committee, make that kind of statement. So yes, I think we are seeing changes. We're seeing some Congress people who are feeling more empowered in some ways because they know that there are Democratic constituents who clearly wish to see our Congress, our country take a different stance in the Middle East, and especially in terms of Palestine, Israel. So I just thought I'd share that because I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm sure it's going to be very difficult for him to get that position because it's a powerful position, but the mere fact that he has come out and said, we need to hear from Palestinian voices, that is something very few people would have said. Maybe somebody like Betty McCullough and also Rashida Taleb, but I can't think of too many other people who would make such a bold statement.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking at some of the comments and questions that audience members have sent in. I'm not sure I have all of them, Emma. I have a question from Darlene, and she says that Manar hosted a podcast early in July about annexation could turn the West Bank to the Gaza Strip open air prison, because American people are increasingly coming to understand, the what is happening to Palestinians, do you think that candidates like Omar should take a more emboldened rather than a defensive approach and work on educating the voters, continuing to educate the voters, sharing some of the ideas that activist leaders activist leaders suggest, like sanction Israel until it complies with BDS demands. So, Menard, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that, Ilhan Omar has gotten our attention a lot because she is put on the defensive, and that's on purpose. Using the ad hominem attacks and, targeting every little word that she says and twisting it around to make it fit into the anti-Semitic trope that, that they accuse her of using. That's on purpose. We've all been there. It's basically to push you in a corner to make you defensive. But I actually think the person who deserves the spotlight in terms of giving the most attention to Palestinian human rights is actually Rashida Taleb, who is a Palestinian. She has kind of been pushed on the sideline, and maybe purposely because she is Palestinian. But she is constantly wearing the Palestinian thobe. She is representing the Palestinian culture in ways that I could not have ever imagined, a Palestinian would be able to in Congress. She also organized a trip, for members to go to Palestine to see the occupation and apartheid firsthand. And so we have to look to give people like Rashida Taleb, who I know at times kind of is a little careful as well. I mean, I see it with all the candidates. They're a little too careful with the kinds of things that they say in terms of bringing attention to, Israeli human rights abuses. But even, AOC recently, in reference to Israeli annexation of the West Bank, she made a comment that if Israel annexes, they could be practicing apartheid. And I just laughed when I read that because people were like, yes, she's using the word apartheid and, good for her. And it's like, I hate to break it to you, AOC, but Israel has been engaging in apartheid for over 60 years. And so we have to really hold our own so-called, progressive elected officials accountable and demand that they, take a more, harsher stance. I mean, I know people like Paul Wellstone. He died, but he was somebody who wasn't afraid to speak the truth. And we need to really encourage more candidates to speak that truth. And because what Israel is doing to the West Bank with this annexation plan, what they could be doing is turn the West Bank into the next Gaza, because Israel is going to be encircling, which it already does anyways, but it's going to go times a million now with more barricades and fences around the West Bank. Basically what they've done to Gaza, which is to entrap the people in the West Bank from having any way out of the West Bank. And Israel is going to be controlling all imports and exports. Israel is now going to be the one, and Israel is going to be taking over all of the water resources and the streams in the West Bank as well, and all the all the fertile land is going to now belong to Israel, even though that area from the West Bank to the Jordan Valley is already militarily occupied by Israel. So yes, I do believe that we have to demand more from our elected officials. Unfortunately, if you are running under the Democratic Party, it's going to be much harder for you. I mean, look at people like Bernie Sanders, who a lot of young people had hoped for and really loved. He said a lot of great things in talking about ending war and holding corporations accountable and so forth, but he never really went far enough to really support Palestinian human rights. Sure, he said Palestinians deserve human rights, but he also said that Israel has a right to exist and defend itself while Israel is committing grave war crimes against, defenseless Palestinians in Gaza. And so we really have to push more. And so the answer to all of this is, in my personal opinion, is to not vote within the Democratic Party. We have to dismantle both the Republican and the Democratic Party. We have to boycott both parties. They're both corporate parties, they're both war parties, and we have to push for alternative candidates, third party candidates, because what a thought, you know, in a democracy, we should have a third party candidate, and perhaps more alternative candidates to represent we the people.
Thank you, Manar. I want to insert one thing that Raphael was referring to a book that he would like everyone to know about, and the title is How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. And it's by, is this correct? Daniel Immerwal, Immerwal. So that's something to put down in your, or put down in your stack of things, must read items. We have a question from Zayed, sorry. How could we support Hamas and pro-Hamas people who are, I have to move this a little, who are purely against freedom? I think it is better to try to change the mindset of those pro-Hamas in order to oh, I'm missing part of this question, I'm sorry. Well, I lost it there.
I have the question.
Thank you. Please read the question.
It says, how could we support, it's a weird question. How could we support Hamas and pro-Hamas who are purely against democracy and freedom? I think it's better to try to change the mindset of those pro-Hamas in order to attract people all over the world than only in the US.
Perhaps he means support anti-Hamas people, Hamas people.
I'm
And
not sure what that meant. Tarek sounds like he knows.
Tarek has a, go ahead. No?
Yeah, no. I'm just bewildered by the question too.
I think
he's
turned the question around.
Yeah,
a bit.
I understand what was meant by the question. I meant I was bewildered by what was meant by the question as well, not just what the question said. But before I do that, I wanted to emphasize something that I forgot to emphasize before when you asked me about BDS, is the actual demands of BDS. And this is an essential point to make because it is often missed in the discourse relating to BDS. The demands are minimalist. The demands are mainstream principles of international law. It's not anything extreme. It's not anything anti-Semitic. It's very, very simple. It's 3 basic demands. And the occupation of all Arab lands occupied by Israel. That would be the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Syrian Golan Heights. And the next demand would be the implementation of the Palestinian right of return. And the last demand is equality for the Palestinian citizens that live within the internationally recognized borders of Israel proper. So, I mean, these demands are basic, they're mainstream. It's the Zionist project and Zionist policies that are the extreme. So the media, what it's trying to do is reverse that and make BDS and the goals of BDS and the demands of BDS as the extreme and Zionism as the mainstream. Zionist objectives are not grounded in international law. BDS objectives are in international law and norms. So we have to make that point clear so that people can understand that when they support BDS, they're supporting a mainstream institution, mainstream goals that are grounded in international law. Now, as for that question, you know, I will respond very succinctly that Hamas was created in 1987. Israel was created in 1948. The dispossession of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of the people of Palestine, the theft of their land, the oppression, the suppression, the collective punishment, what we're experiencing today flows from that history. So you have to look at the chain of causation. And if you want to start the clock at 1987, well, then you're missing decades of history that really paved the way for resistance type movements. So to talk about Hamas in a vacuum is not the way to talk about it. And I will never, and in all of my speeches that I do on Palestine, when I get questions like this, it is beyond me. And it's absolutely wrong to answer the question as asked, because I disagree with the premise of the question. If I disagree with the premise of the question, I cannot answer that question directly. The premise of the question is that this institution that was created in 1987 is the problem. No, this institution came about as a result of decades of dispossession, apartheid, and oppression, and settler colonialism. It's the settler colonial project of Zionism that is at the root of this. So do you want to focus on the root, or do you want to focus on the symptom? And I can't answer a question that focuses on the symptom, because that's the wrong way to actually get to a solution here. So that's really my comment to that, is that I mean, with all due respect, first of all, it's irrelevant, I think. And also to an extent, it doesn't really, actually to a large extent, it does not tackle the root of the problem, the actual, the realities of what's happening on the ground right now. So, you know, I think that should put that to rest.
Thank you for that response. I want to turn us back to bring us back into the United States, because I'm thinking about connections you might see, political and activist connections you might see between work for Palestinian rights and Black Lives Matter movement in this country, and the militarization of the United States police across the country, and the militarization of our border with Mexico. Would any of you be willing to take on kind of a piece of that, or a general kind of conceptual sense of things? So how about this? Let's start from a narrow, that's maybe too broad a topic, but from a narrower perspective. I think, Raphael, you did mention the Jewish Voice for Peace project about the training of US police. Sometimes leadership is trained in Israel, and sometimes people come here. Can you tell us a little more about that project, please? Whoops. And I'm not able to. I'm having trouble.
We're good.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Yeah, so part of JVP, we have a campaign against the deadly exchange, which is essentially the Israeli military will send trainers to our police force here in the United States, and they will train them in riot tactics and many different ways to train our police in how to deal with protests, to deal with like even just like individuals. And we saw that with George Floyd in the way that the police officer was, one of those trainings was through the Israeli military. And we also see that through our funding, our military aid to Israel also then comes back to us through trainings. So there's that piece. And so basically what JVP is trying to do is end that exchange so that police are not trained. And I mean, our goal now is just total abolition of the police, because there's not really a way to, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of JVP as well, there's not really a way to reform the police because of the very fact that they come from slave patrols, and they come from a settler colonial system, which was designed to oppress people. And so it's just not, it has never been and is not a viable solution. And this comes from decades and centuries of Black organizing and Indigenous organizing. And we have to recognize all the work that has been done prior to this, and then what is now happening in this movement now is that we need change, and we need to totally abolish that, along with, I mean, the prison industrial complexes and abolishing ICE, and all of those things relate to as well the border and our border patrol, and how they, I mean, if you look at our border patrol, it in some ways reflects what is seen in Palestine with the apartheid wall. And it's a similar situation, I think, in some ways, in that they're separating people and breaking up communities, because those lands were sacred lands of Indigenous people, and they were cut through their ancestral burial grounds. And we see the organizing now. There's several organizing different Indigenous groups on the ground fighting right now as we speak, to stop these walls from being built and from the border patrol controlling those areas in their rightful Indigenous land. So we're seeing those things take effect here as well. So that's what I have to say on that. And I'd love to hear what everyone else has to say. I think Sana, I'm seeing her hand.
Thank you. Sana, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad Raphael spoke to some of what is historical in terms of policing, and of course some that is indeed because of the exchange. And so we know historically, when we look at policing in America, its roots go back to slavery, and also during the period before, after Reconstruction and so forth. And at the same time, we are aware, and so even in terms of Israel-Palestine, we've got what is often the case in a colonial situation, that the colonial settlers are indeed, do employ tactics against the people that they are controlling that are certainly very similar to what we see here in the United States. In terms of exchanges, and we can be more specific about Minnesota, one of the things that we discovered in some of our research is that I think it was in 2012, 2013, Israel was invited to come to Minnesota and train about 100 officers throughout the state. And so I think it was a 2 or 3 day training program. We've also been able to identify a period when our chief here in St. Paul went to a training in Israel. I believe it was the end of 2017 or 2018. And so we do know that these kinds of exchanges do take place. And of course, throughout the United States, there are more than 300 police departments that have engaged in trainings either in Israel or Israeli military coming to the United States to train individuals.
Thank you. Thank you, Sana. Anyone else have something to add? Okay. We have talked. We've talked about a lot of things. Each of you has, as we've gone through this time together, and we appreciate your candid comments. We've talked briefly and from time to time about Minnesota's 5th district. And Let's turn back to that for just a few minutes before we say goodnight to people. And I wonder if we can think or talk about what is at stake for the citizens of the voters, the citizens, the residents of the Minnesota's 5th district, and for the anti-war movement, for the BDS campaign, and for the prospects of justice in the Middle East. What does the 5th district have to do with it? Anyone want to kind of take on the 5th district? Not. Santa will give it a try.
I guess the only thing I want to say is, and I'm thinking back to the in quote, controversy that kind of got us where we are today in terms of the 5th district with someone, a challenger to Omar. And I think back to, maybe for some of us, it may be considered irony, and for others, truth, in what many of us have known is that Omar's campaign exposes what Ilmar said in her tweet in response to Glenn Greenwald's statement. And Greenwald said, "It's stunning how much time US political leaders spend defending a foreign nation, even if it means attacking free speech rights of Americans." And then what we've seen is that, and of course, Omar responds, it's all about the Benjamins. And what we have seen in her campaign is that with her challenger, the Benjamins have been flowing in to elect a man who we all know, who's made it very clear he will be a mouthpiece for Israel. All you need to do is go to his campaign website. So I guess, she told us the truth, and we are seeing it before our very eyes. And so I guess that's the irony of all of this, because immediately when this so-called controversy took place back in, I think it might have been February of 2019, by that March, we had pro-Israel lobby people who were looking for a challenger to Ilhan. And so we just see how the Israel lobby works. And it's everything that many of us already knew. It's essentially what Ilhan responded to when she responded to Glenn Greenwald's tweet. And of course, we see where this has gotten her. It'll be interesting to see what happens in this particular campaign, whether or not she will be successful. If she is, I can assure you that will not be the end. And I think all of us know that. That will not be the end. Even though I'm still asking people, why is there a difference between the way Ilhan has been treated and the way Betty McCollum has been treated? Betty has called Israel an apartheid state. So Betty has refused to condemn BDS. And maybe someone can respond to that, but I am curious, what's the difference?
Thank you, Sana. I have lost my question sheet. Emma, is there a new question?
Yeah, we've got one more question out of not very many. So those that are still with us, please don't hesitate to send a question for our last few minutes if you have something. On Facebook, John Gold asked, what about the differences between a one-state solution over a two-state solution? I don't know if there's anybody that would like to contribute. All right, Tariq.
It's Tariq, by the way, but yeah. So the discourse around the one-state, two-state solution and now I'm speaking now I'm giving you my own opinion. ANP as a 501c3, we do not have a position on one state, two states, and it's not about which one is preferable. It's about what is the discourse surrounding right now within the conservative Zionist circle. They actually, a lot of them are actually, especially the evangelical right and hardline messianic redemptionist kind of Zionism. They're proposing a one-state reality that exists today, but just full annexation. Just take the whole territory, either get rid of the Palestinians or don't give them voting rights, essentially advocating for apartheid. So when you say one state, we have to be clear on what one state we're talking about. Are we talking about the one state that exists right now? The status quo is a one state reality. Israel has control of the entire area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It has full control. Even though there's territorial divisions somewhat in the West Bank, namely areas A, B, and C, with area C being under full Israeli control, and that's about 60% of the West Bank. The remaining 40%, while it is under the civil control of the Palestinian Authority, that control is limited. They do not have sovereignty, and Israel can enter those areas A and B, at will, whenever it needs to impose its will on the Palestinians, or if it needs to punish Palestinians or invade somebody's home, whatever the case may be. If we mean by one state a one democratic state where there's full equality for all, well, that strikes against the Zionist project, because the basis of the Zionist project is territorial maximalism and demographic maximalism with respect to the Jewish population, and Palestinian minimalism. So that means as much land as possible with as few Palestinians in it as possible. So what does that ultimately do? What it ultimately does is it keeps the Palestinians out. It brings in as many Jews as possible in, and that is the Zionist project at its core. So I think that when we talk about one state, two states, we have to keep these things in mind. The entire Zionist basis of a two-state solution is premised on the fact of, okay, we'll give them 22% of historic Palestine. Why? Because the majority of the Palestinian population that are not in the diaspora outside of historic Palestine, they live in those areas. So if you actually look at the entire area of historic Palestine, that encompasses the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Israel proper, you essentially have demographic parity. There's about 7 million or so Palestinians and about 7 million or so Jewish Israelis. So you have demographic parity in that whole land. If there were only 2 million Palestinians living in that entire area, I have no doubt Israel would be pushing not for partial annexation, but for total annexation of the entire area. The reason why liberal Zionists are pushing for a two-state solution is because they want to, at the very least, consolidate the gains of the Zionist project up until now and forfeit any future potential gains. So look, we grabbed 78% of historic Palestine. We accomplished partial ethnic cleansing. Let's just declare sovereignty over the land that we have so far. We're still the demographic majority in that land, and give the remaining land to the Palestinians so they can have their own state. It's still premised on racism. It's still premised on ethnic exclusivism. So when we have this one state, two state discourse, even if you're advocates of two states or one states, you have to understand this one basic element, that the rights of the Palestinian people is not dependent upon the territorial demarcation of that land. Whether that land is under one state, two state, three states, blue state, red state, yellow state, purple state, it does not matter. Let me give you an example. So let's take a look at the Palestinian right of return. The Palestinian right of return is an individual right. for the individual Palestinian. It is also a collective right for the Palestinian people. And the reference to the Palestinian right of return, if you look at the International Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international laws and norms, the reference is always to country or homes. And what that essentially means is, regardless of who the sovereign is of the state of the area in question, it is irrelevant to the question of whether Palestinians have the right to return there. So if you're a Palestinian from Haifa or Jaffa, you have the right to go back to those lands, regardless of who that sovereign territory belongs to, regardless if it's under the Israeli state or a different state. It doesn't matter. So and the confusion is in trying to make this distinction between refugee law, which is international law, is governed by an international framework, and immigration law, which is domestic law, governed by the domestic framework. And what Zionists are trying to do is intertwine these two things to say Israel has the right to its own immigration law. So in a future two-state solution, the Palestinians would have the right to go back to a future Palestinian state. But that's not what international law demands. International law demands that they go back to their homes, regardless of who the sovereign of that area is. So that's really the point that we have to emphasize when we talk about this. When the debate is on territorial demarcation, one state versus two states, we have to change the discussion to a rights-based framework. And once you implement rights, then this whole talk about territorial demarcation would have so much less traction.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's about 5 minutes to 9 right now. We had said that we wouldn't go longer than 9. I have lost Manar's video. I don't see her anymore.
Manar had to leave for the night, so
Okay.
she is gone.
Okay. Well, thank you, Manar, wherever you are. And if anyone has anything briefly to close up, and wave your fingers at me. And if not, on behalf of WAM's Middle East Committee, I say thank you to each of you. And thank you for kind of broadening our view, our sense of what we're talking about when we're looking at these campaigns in our own country and how they can be influenced by world events and oppressions and life and death in places that we need to be aware of and think about and take to heart. So thank you very much for your participation, your insights, and your knowledge. Thank you. And I'm going to say good night. All right? Good night. Good night.